At last year's NATO summit, its members pledged to spend 5% of their GDPs on defense. This could give the United States a real opportunity to shift the burden for Europe's defense onto Europeans themselves. While President Trump has touted this pledge as a major victory for the United States, the administration has made several moves in recent years that have undermined Europe's quest for strategic autonomy. A new defense priorities paper argues that it is key for U.S. interests to help Europe unlock its defense potential. My guest today, Thomas Cavanna, is a non resident fellow at Defense Priorities and the author of that paper. Thomas and I are going to discuss this 5% pledge and if it's important and really matters, and why it's in America's interests to let Europe rearm. Here are three things you need to know. Hey, Thomas, thanks for joining me today to talk about your new explainer on Europe and its and NATO and the pledge to reach 5%. So in the introduction, I talked a little bit about that pledge and how President Trump had touted it as a big win. But I'm wondering if this is something that the Europeans can really achieve. And if they are able to achieve it, does it really matter? Is defense spending ultimately the metric that we want to look at when it comes to Europe achieving strategic autonomy?
Hey, Adam. Great to see you. And thank you for those questions. I'm excited to talk about this report. So to address your question, I think there are reasons to be cautious about the 5% pledge made by NATO members last summer. I think the skeptics have reasons to be skeptical. And I think there are three main types of reasons for that, three sets of reasons.
Sure.
The first set is has to do with how we evaluate. It has to do with the 5% itself. So first, as you know, the 5% isn't really 5%. It's actually 3.5% for core defense purposes and 1.5% for non-traditional defense investments, cybersecurity, the protection of critical infrastructure. And of course, those things are important. This 1.5% is important, but it's not exactly military in a traditional sense, combat capability, et cetera, et cetera. Also, about this 1.5% plus 3.5%, there is the fact that it's basically a share of GDP. It's about spending 5% of your GDP on defense in a broad sense. And the problem with that kind of indicators is that by definition, it's a little bit arbitrary and it can be easily distorted. For example, if a country records a very big increase in its GDP or a very big decrease in its GDP, it's going to distort the ratio. And as a result, the picture that you have for the defense situation is not really what it seems to be. I would add to this the fact that if you look at the implementation requirements for those 5% and the fact that we're also dealing with a 10-year time frame, we are talking about a pledge that's supposed to be fulfilled by 2035. There are loopholes, and that could create a temptation in some countries, in some governments, to cook the books, to be a little bit creative with the accounting. And that would, of course, distort the results at the end of the day on the battlefield. So that was the first set of reasons. The second set of reasons, I think, has to do with Europe's commitment, and whether Europe will be able to deliver. So here I would start with the economies of Europe. As you know, the economies of Europe have struggled basically since the 2008 financial crisis. GDP growth is very low. They are struggling welfare systems. There is popular discontent. And there is also a huge national debt in many countries. And in that context, it's, I think, legitimate to really wonder whether the Europeans will be able to deliver.
The Iran war hasn't helped very much either, has it?
Yes, and I could get back to that a little bit later. But yes, the Trump administration hasn't helped Europe in that domain. But there is this economic problem. And behind that, of course, if we look at history, there is a history of European free riding on American investments. There is also a history of European leaders over-promising and then under-delivering. And from that standpoint, we could also emphasize that the last pledge that NATO members made, that was back in 2014, that was a pledge to spend 2% of each country's GDP on defense. That was following the Russian annexation of Ukraine. And if we look at the situation
of Crimea,
today,
of Crimea, right?
Of Crimea, yes, of course. If we look at the situation today in 2026, we still have some European countries that are below the 2%. And if we look at the big European powers, if we look at the French, the British, the Germans, the Italians, the Spanish, many of those countries are either below the 2% or right above the 2%. So there's still, a big step up if we want to reach the 5% in one decade on the European side. And the final set of reasons that I would add to this has to do with how you convert your investments into military capabilities, combat capability on the ground. It's important to remember that the Europeans have underspent for decades, so they will really have to spend a lot of money for a long time to catch up with this deficit. The money that they have spent also was often spent on other military objectives. It was about preparing for humanitarian interventions, for counterinsurgency, not really for traditional military capabilities. And that is, of course, an issue. And finally, there is the ever-pervasive problem of coordination, because when we talk about the 5% pledge, we are talking about 30 European states that are supposed to spend 5% of their GDP on defense. But even if they do that, each of them, you do not have any assurance that the overall result at the European level will be coordinated, will be coherent. There could be very significant duplication, very significant waste, etc. So this is for the skepticism. Now, why am I reasonably optimistic about this despite all of the problems that we mentioned? I think there is a very significant reason, that is Europe's power potential. We hear a lot about Europe struggling, Europe not doing this, not doing that, falling short, falling behind. But if we look at Europe's power potential, if we look at its population, if we look at its industrial advancement, its technological capabilities, we have a continent that is able to make those investments, that is able to defend itself, especially if we consider the main security threat that the Europeans are facing today, which is Russia. So that would be a big reason for optimism. The second reason for optimism, I think, has to do with the shift in mindset that we are beginning to see among European leaders. I think that there has been a real evolution among European leaders since the first Trump administration, then the Russian invasion of Ukraine, then the second Trump administration. I think the Europeans are starting to realize that they have to step up, that the United States will not always do the heavy lifting. And we have seen increases in military budgets in many European countries. We have seen interesting European Union initiatives in the domain of defense. So that, I think, is very positive, even though it remains to be confirmed in the long term. And I would also add another reason for optimism in a slightly different perspective, which is the fact that even though the Europeans are still not there by 2035, they're still not at 5% per se, even if they reach only 3.5% or 4% of their GDP on defense, I think that could still be a pretty big win for the United States, for the transatlantic relationship. And that, I think, is something that they can definitely hope to reach in the next decade.
Okay. So, President Trump has been really hard on NATO countries. He's even threatened to leave at some points. But at the same time, he's touted this pledge. He said that he wanted Europe to take on more of the burden for its own security. But at the same time, you write in your paper about some of the ways that the Trump administration has undermined this effort. I mean, I mentioned one of them briefly during your first answer, which is the economic impact of the Iran war. But I'm wondering if you can break this down a little bit more in detail for us about how exactly the Trump administration is undermining Europe's ability to achieve strategic autonomy.
Yes, so that's a great question. And we can say, looking at the Trump administration's first 18 months, that there are some things that Washington has done that that are moving things in the right direction, but there are also many ambiguities, many problems, potentially crippling problems in America's approach to the transatlantic relationship. So I would start with, what you said about the fact that the Trump administration has sent some signals to European countries, to NATO allies in the last 18 months that they have to step up, they have to assume primary responsibility for their security. So the rhetoric has changed clearly. And we have seen a number of measures by Washington that seem to push the Europeans in this direction of greater investment, greater responsibilities. We have seen minor troop withdrawals. We have seen some transfers of commands and leadership positions within the NATO alliance. So there are things that are moving in the right direction. And of course, there is also the fact that President Trump and other American officials have been very clear that Europeans have to step up, that the United States support is not to be taken for granted. Now, sometimes those statements, those policies went too far, were too aggressive, and so on. But that's another question that I will leave aside for today. But as you also emphasized, if we look more closely at the Trump administration's policies, we see many ambiguities. There are many reasons to believe that the commitment of the Trump administration to retrenchment is less strong than it seemed to be in the first place. For example, we know that the America First coalition contains a vast number of people with different ideas about American foreign policy, but some of them are not interested in restraint. They are not interested in retrenchment. They're actually more interested in the perpetuation of America's primacy. We also know that President Trump is very much fascinated by military power and is trying to push for a huge increase in America's military budget next year, which is a sign that the US still wants to assume many responsibilities. And of course, you mentioned the war in Iran. That is a great sign of the Trump administration and of the president's interest in interventionism. The United States is repeating the same patterns as in the past. And at the end of the day, we also have, if we look at the bigger picture, behind the Trump administration, we still have a very powerful industrial military complex in the United States, many powerful forces in the business world, in the Department of Defense, in the intelligence community, and in Congress, many people who want the United States to do more of the same, as opposed to envisioning retrenchment. And from that perspective, my personal take, if we look at the first 18 months of the Trump 2 administration, is that instead of retrenchment, instead of the United States really giving space to the Europeans so that they would build their autonomy in the sphere of defense, I'm afraid that what the Trump administration actually wants is to have the Europeans do more to some extent in order to alleviate the American burden, but without sacrificing America's power, without sacrificing America's hegemony, without renouncing all of the forms of involvement of the United States in Europe. And maybe to illustrate this, I could use two examples. The first one is that, in my opinion, the Trump administration has compounded Europe's military dependence on the United States in the last 18 months. For example, the American military footprint in Europe hasn't changed much since the Biden administration, still about 80,000 troops. If we look at America's command positions in NATO, leadership positions in NATO, we have seen the Trump administration abandon some of those positions, but we have seen the Trump administration consolidate its power, its influence, its grip over many other commands, many other leadership positions. And that, of course, doesn't help Europe in a military sense. The second example that I would use is the economic example and industrial military example. So that, goes back to what you were saying earlier about the Iran war. Here also, I would argue that many of the policies that the Trump administration has conducted since January 2025 have actually undermined the economic and the industrial military foundations of a European defense buildup up to 5% of GDP, as mentioned in the NATO pledge. First, we have a series of economic policies that are either directly hurting the Europeans, think about the tariffs, for example,
Right.
or indirectly hurting the Europeans, think about the Iran war and the cost that the Iran war had on European economies, and the fact that Washington didn't really take that into account before the conflict. But in addition to this, we have seen many attempts by the Trump administration to entrench, to deepen, to consolidate the dependency of European leaders, European nations on the United States in key economic domains. I'm thinking about Buy American requirements in the field of energy. I'm thinking about pressures to ensure that American technological companies will still lead in Europe, will not face a growing European resistance. Right. I'm also thinking about some financial pressures for Europe to continue to invest in the United States, and so on and so on. And the final point here would be the industrial military level per se, because as you know, one of the most important measures that the Trump administration has taken vis-a-vis Europe, vis-a-vis NATO allies, vis-a-vis the EU in the last year was to impose Buy American requirements when it comes to military hardware, which is to say that the Europeans are required to invest a huge chunk of their military investments on American military gear, American technologies, American military hardware. And that, of course, is not something that's going to help the many fragmented military industries that exist in Europe, those industries that need those contracts, that need to benefit from European defense investments. And of course, the other side of the picture is that in the meantime, the Trump administration has very aggressively pushed against any significant effort by the Europeans to consolidate their defense sector, to consolidate their defense industries. And that, of course, is very self-defeating with the NATO 5% pledge.
Sure. So you laid out a really comprehensive picture there of what the Trump administration is doing in terms of putting obstacles in the way for Europe. Let's assume that the administration got serious about its rhetoric, or the next president did. What could the U.S. do to help Europe really unlock its defense and security potential? And can then you break down for us why this is a good thing for America, why this would be in U.S. interests?
Yes, of course. Great questions. So on the first question, what the United States can do, I would divide my answer in three different parts, corresponding to three different levels of analysis. The strategic level, the industrial level, industrial military level, and the operational level. And I think that the core of the problem for each of those levels of analysis is that for each of those levels of analysis, the strategic, industrial, military level, and operational, you have very deep European weaknesses that exist in Europe, but you also have an American hegemonic strategy, a strategy by the United States to remain dominant in Europe and to suppress any serious effort by the Europeans to step up, to actually make the efforts that Washington officially wants the Europeans to make. So if we look at the strategic level, I think that what the United States could do simply is to renounce, or at least to scale down, its hegemonic ambitions over Europe, to understand that in order for the Europeans to assume more responsibilities, to become more autonomous, to be able to defend themselves, America has to give them the space to do so and the incentives to do so. And as long as the United States is maintaining the same hegemonic policies in the past, it's not going to happen. So it's about toning down those hegemonic ambitions and at the same time encouraging all the efforts that exist in different parts of Europe and in the European Union to overcome divisions among European countries, to invest more money in defense and defense-related domains, and to assert also a strategic voice that would be independent from that of the United States. So that's a strategic level. At the industrial military level, I think that the United States could consider ending all of the aggressive economic measures that it has taken against Europe, or the measures that have indirectly hurt European economies. The Iran war is a good example of this. I think that the United States should also renounce its buy American proposals in the domain of energy and in the domain of military hardware in particular. And I think that the United States, going back to the end of the hegemonic policies I discussed before, I think the United States should stop this tradition, should end its tradition of suppressing or inhibiting or opposing all of the efforts that European leaders are making in order to achieve a greater degree of integration at the European level in the military domain and in the industrial military domain. Finally, at the operational level, I would also argue the same thing, which is that in order to give Europe the space and the incentives to step up, to really make those big investments and to really change its mindset, the United States should be serious about retrenchment. So the American military footprint in Europe should decline. The United States should also be serious about withdrawing some of the capabilities that it has deployed in Europe for a long time, starting with capabilities that the Europeans can replace now or could replace reasonably easily. And another dimension of this, of course, would be to really relinquish command positions and leadership positions within the NATO alliance more than what we have seen to the present day. And I think the philosophy behind that is that as long as the United States remains in the middle and keeps doing those things that it has done for several decades, the Europeans will not be able to step up. And the Europeans might actually go back to their default mode, which is to expect European support and European leadership in all circumstances. We have seen, as we discussed earlier, kind of wake-up call in Europe in the last 18 months. The Europeans are trying to do more, and I think this is a positive and important trend. But we also know, even after the Greenland controversy, even after the Iran war, that the Europeans remain very divided. They also remain very ambivalent when it comes to making real sacrifices in the name of a true defense buildup. And they also still have a tendency, we see this, ahead of the NATO annual summit in Ankara, we still see a very, very deep desire by European leaders to repair the transatlantic relationship at all costs. Right. So that seems to suggest that as long as America doesn't change its position in a very clear and consistent manner, the Europeans will not step up. Now, very quickly about the advantages, the gains that the United States would make with those changes and with this European expansion in the defense domain. I think that we could talk about financial gains. The United States could probably save dozens of billions of dollars by withdrawing some of its troops, some of its capabilities from the European continent. I think it also makes sense from a strategic perspective because Europe is less important than it used to be. It's still important, but it's less important than it used to be, especially compared to the Indo-Pacific, to the Western Hemisphere, and to America's domestic priorities. And in that sense, we should also think not only about reallocating financial resources, but also reallocating much needed capabilities from Europe to other parts of the world, and reallocating brain power as well, making sure that the huge amount of expertise that the US government is focusing on Europe, has focused on Europe for decades, can be better shared, better diluted across other regions that are today more important than Europe for the United States. So those, I think, would be the greatest gains for Washington.
Well, great. Thanks a lot, Thomas. I mean, with the NATO summit coming up next week, I hope that both, leaders on both sides of the Atlantic can take to heart some of the recommendations and analysis you have in your paper. I want to encourage everybody to visit defensepriorities.org and check out your paper and all the work that Defense Priorities is doing on this issue and all the important topics in international politics today. So thanks a lot, Thomas.
Thank you, Adam. It was a real pleasure as usual.